Picture this. You're a young nobleman invited to witness the coronation of King Philip Augustus of France in 1179 AD. The cathedral bells ring across Paris as you enter the sacred halls of Notre Dame, expecting to witness a solemn religious ceremony that will crown God's chosen representative on earth. Instead, you find yourself watching rituals so bizarre, so sexually charged, so utterly perverse that they would make a modern person's skin crawl with disgust and disbelief. The newly crowned king stands before an altar draped in crimson silk. But this isn't any ordinary blessing. Ancient pagan traditions have been woven into Christian ceremony, creating something that exists in the shadows between sacred and profane. You watch in stunned silence as the archbishop performs rites that were old when Rome was young, ceremonies that transform political power into something far more intimate and disturbing. Before diving into these forgotten stories of medieval excess and corruption, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Welcome to the dark underbelly of medieval European royalty, where absolute power created appetites so twisted that even the church struggled to contain them. What I'm about to reveal isn't found in your typical history textbook. These are the rituals that medieval chroniclers wrote about in coded Latin, the ceremonies that were whispered about in monastery scriptoriums, the traditions that shaped the most powerful men in Europe while corrupting their souls in ways that would echo through generations. Today, we're going to explore 10 of the most perverted rituals practiced by medieval European kings, ceremonies so shocking that many were eventually banned by papal decree, yet continued in secret for centuries. These weren't isolated incidents or the actions of a few mad rulers. These were systematic traditions passed down through royal bloodlines, each more disturbing than the last. But first, let me give you a taste of what we're dealing with. In 1204 AD, King John of England participated in a ritual known as the Ceremony of Sacred Virility, where newly crowned monarchs were required to demonstrate their sexual prowess before a council of bishops and nobles. The details of this ritual were so explicit that they were recorded only in encrypted manuscripts that weren't decoded until the 20th century. When historians finally cracked the code, they discovered practices that would make ancient Roman orgies seem tame by comparison. The first ritual on our list involves something called the Royal Deflowering Ceremony, a tradition that spread across multiple European kingdoms during the 12th and 13th centuries. This wasn't just about political marriages or securing bloodlines. This was about power in its most primal form, disguised as religious obligation. King Louis VII of France, known to history as Louis the Young, participated in this ritual when he married Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1137 AD. What most people don't realize is that medieval royal weddings weren't private affairs between two people. They were public spectacles where the consummation itself became a ceremony witnessed by dozens of nobles, clergy, and court officials. But the Royal Deflowering Ceremony went far beyond simple witness. The bride, typically between 12 and 14 years old, Nutty, was prepared through days of ritualistic bathing in water, blessed by 7 different bishops. Her body was anointed with oils that had been consecrated through prayers so ancient that their origins predated Christianity itself. These weren't normal wedding preparations. These were spiritual preparations for what the medieval church considered a form of divine sacrifice. On the wedding night, the bride was carried to the marriage chamber, not by her female attendants, but by a procession of monks chanting in Latin verses that, when translated, reveal prayers asking for the woman's spirit to be broken and reshaped to serve her husband's will. The groom, meanwhile, underwent his own preparation ritual involving fasting, prayer, and the consumption of herbs that modern science now recognizes as powerful aphrodisiacs mixed with hallucinogenic compounds. The chamber itself was prepared according to specifications that read like something from a grimoire rather than a religious text. Candles were arranged in specific geometric patterns that corresponded to astrological alignments. The bed was draped with fabrics dyed in colors that symbolized dominance and submission. Most disturbing of all, the walls were decorated with frescoes depicting biblical scenes of conquest, not love, with images of Judith beheading Holofernes and David slaying Goliath, creating a psychological atmosphere of violence and domination. When the moment of consummation arrived, it wasn't conducted in private. A select group of witnesses, including the royal confessor, the court physician, and 3 nobles chosen for their discretion, would observe from behind a specially constructed screen. Their role wasn't merely to verify that the marriage had been completed, they were there to ensure that specific ritual elements were followed, elements so explicit that medieval chroniclers could only hint at them through metaphor and allegory. The ritual required the king to recite specific incantations during the act itself, prayers that invoked not just Christian imagery, but older, darker traditions that traced back to pre-Roman fertility cults. These incantations were believed to transfer not just physical dominance, but spiritual authority, making the queen's body a vessel for the king's divine right to rule. The aftermath was equally disturbing. The bloodied sheets weren't just displayed as proof of consummation, as was common practice. They were subjected to ritualistic examination by the court physician and royal confessor, who would analyze the patterns of blood to determine the spiritual significance of the union. Different patterns supposedly indicated different divine blessings or curses on the marriage, influencing everything from military strategy to tax policy. Eleanor of Aquitaine's experience with this ritual may have contributed to her later rebellion against Louis VII and her eventual annulment of their marriage. Contemporary accounts suggest that she never recovered from the psychological trauma of her wedding night, developing what medieval physicians called melancholia, but what modern psychology would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Our second ritual takes us deep into the forests of medieval Germany, where the Holy Roman emperors practiced something called the hunt of sacred flesh. This wasn't hunting for animals. This was hunting for human prey, specifically young men and women who had been selected through criteria that combined physical beauty with supposed spiritual purity. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, one of the most powerful rulers of the 12th century, institutionalized this ritual during his reign from 1155 to 1190 AD. What started as occasional indulgences became systematic hunts that occurred during specific astronomical events, particularly during eclipses and solstices, when the medieval mind believed the barriers between the physical and spiritual worlds were at their thinnest. The preparation for these hunts began weeks in advance. Royal scouts would travel throughout the empire, identifying potential prey through a process that combined physical examination with astrological calculation. The ideal candidates were between 16 and 20 years old, possessed specific physical characteristics that varied depending on the season and astronomical conditions, and came from families with no political connections that might complicate their disappearance. Once selected, these individuals were brought to remote hunting lodges, deep in the Black Forest, structures that had been modified specifically for these rituals. The lodges contained chambers designed not for comfort, but for what medieval alchemists called spiritual transformation through physical ordeal. Stone altars carved with symbols that predated Christianity, restraining devices that were blessed by corrupt clergy, and tools whose purposes were so disturbing that their descriptions were encoded in alchemical texts that took centuries to decipher. The hunt itself followed rules that were part game, part religious ceremony, part systematic torture. The prey were given a head start into the forest, but they weren't simply being chased by hunters on horseback. They were being pursued by participants who had undergone their own ritual preparations, consuming combinations of herbs and animal blood that induced altered states of consciousness, creating a nightmarish scenario where the line between human and beast became deliberately blurred. What happened when the prey were caught defies description in polite company. Medieval chroniclers could only hint at rituals that combined elements of ancient sacrifice with sexual violence, so systematic that it required detailed instruction manuals passed down through generations of corrupt nobility. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully orchestrated ceremonies designed to transfer what medieval occultists believed was life force from the victims to the perpetrators. The psychological impact on participants was profound and intentional. By crossing the ultimate boundaries of human behavior, by engaging in acts that violated every principle of Christian morality while simultaneously invoking religious imagery. The ritual was designed to create a psychological state where normal moral constraints no longer applied. Participants reported experiencing what they described as divine revelations, visions of power and dominion that convinced them they had transcended ordinary human limitations. Frederick Barbarossa himself wrote coded entries in his private journal about these experiences, describing them as necessary preparations for his role as God's representative on earth. He believed that by engaging in the most extreme violations of human decency, he was demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice everything, including his own soul, for the sake of imperial power. The ritual was, in his twisted logic, the ultimate test of royal dedication. The hunt of sacred flesh continued in various forms throughout the Holy Roman Empire for over 2 centuries, with each emperor adding his own refinements to the basic structure. Some focused on astronomical timing, conducting hunts only during specific planetary alignments. Others incorporated elements from different pagan traditions, creating hybrid rituals that combined Germanic paganism with corrupted Christian theology and imported Eastern mysticism. The ritual finally ended not because of moral objections, but because of political necessity. The increasing power of the Catholic Church and the rise of more centralized monarchies made such extreme practices too dangerous to continue. The evidence was systematically destroyed. Participants were silenced through various means, and the entire tradition was buried beneath layers of official denial and historical revision. But the psychological damage persisted for generations. Many noble families who had participated in these rituals developed what medieval physicians called hereditary melancholia, patterns of mental instability and moral corruption that seemed to pass from father to son. Modern historians studying genealogical records have identified suspicious patterns of suicide, madness, and extreme cruelty among the descendants of known participants, suggesting that the trauma of these rituals created psychological wounds that echoed through bloodlines for centuries. These first 2 rituals represent just the beginning of our journey into the darkest corners of medieval royal depravity. What we've seen so far, shocking as it may be, pales in comparison to what's coming next. The rituals we've examined were at least conducted under the pretense of religious or political necessity. The ceremonies that follow had no such justification. They were pure expressions of power corrupted beyond all recognition, practices so vile that even medieval chroniclers, who lived in an age of casual brutality, could barely bring themselves to record them. The third ritual on our list brings us to the court of King Henry II of England, where something called the Ceremony of Nocturnal Dominion transformed the very concept of royal authority into something that belonged more in a nightmare than a throne room. This wasn't about politics or diplomacy. This was about a king who believed that true power could only be achieved by demonstrating absolute control over the most fundamental aspects of human existence. Henry II, who ruled from 1144 to 1189 AD, developed this ritual after his conflicts with Thomas Becket, convinced him that even the church posed a threat to his absolute authority. If he couldn't control the spiritual realm through conventional means, he would create his own spiritual practices, ceremonies that would place him beyond the reach of papal condemnation because they operated outside the boundaries of conventional morality entirely. The Ceremony of Nocturnal Dominion required the king to select members of his own court, people who had served him faithfully, who trusted him completely, and who had no reason to suspect that their loyalty would be rewarded with horrors beyond imagination. The selection process itself was ritualistic, conducted during the darkest nights of winter when, according to medieval astrology, the king's connection to earthly power was at its strongest. Those selected were summoned to private chambers deep within the castle, rooms that had been modified according to specifications found in manuscripts that Henry's scholars had acquired from Byzantine sources. These texts, written in Greek so archaic that only the most learned monks could translate them, described practices that had supposedly been used by Roman emperors who had achieved godlike status through systematic violation of human dignity. The chambers themselves were designed to disorient and terrorize. Mirrors were arranged to create infinite reflections. Candlelight was filtered through colored glass to cast unnatural shadows. and the air was thick with incense that contained compounds known to induce hallucinations and psychological instability. Participants would find themselves in an environment where reality itself seemed to bend and shift, where their normal understanding of right and wrong became meaningless. What Henry demanded of these loyal servants went beyond mere submission. He required them to participate in acts that were designed to destroy their sense of self, to reduce them to instruments of his will so completely that they would lose all capacity for independent moral judgment. The specific details of these acts were recorded in cipher by the royal confessor, who was himself so corrupted by what he witnessed that he eventually took his own life, but not before hiding his encrypted accounts in the walls of Canterbury Cathedral. When these accounts were finally discovered and decoded in the 19th century, scholars were so disturbed by their contents that many refused to publish their translations. Those who did publish their findings often died under mysterious circumstances, leading to persistent rumors that the descendants of Henry's court maintained some form of secret organization dedicated to suppressing evidence of their ancestors' crimes. The psychological impact on participants was exactly what Henry intended. By forcing them to engage in acts that violated every principle they had been raised to believe in, he created a court of people who were psychologically dependent on him for their sense of reality. They could no longer trust their own moral instincts because those instincts had been systematically destroyed. They became extensions of Henry's will, incapable of independent thought or action. The ritual reached its climax during what Henry called the moment of ultimate surrender, when participants were required to perform a final act that would forever separate them from the possibility of redemption. This act was different for each person, carefully calculated based on their individual psychological profiles and deepest fears. For some, it involved the violation of religious vows they had held sacred. For others, it meant betraying family members or destroying relationships that had defined their identity. The effect on Henry himself was equally profound, but in a different way. Each ceremony convinced him further that he had transcended ordinary human limitations, that he had achieved a form of divine status that placed him beyond the reach of conventional morality. He began to see himself not as a king ruling by divine right, but as a god walking among mortals, with the absolute authority to reshape reality according to his desires. This delusion of godhood influenced every aspect of Henry's reign. His conflicts with the church intensified because he genuinely believed that papal authority was meaningless compared to his own divine status. His treatment of his family became increasingly erratic and cruel, as he applied the same psychological techniques he used on his court to his own sons and wife. His military campaigns became more brutal and seemingly random, as he sought to demonstrate his power over life and death on an ever larger scale. The ceremony of Nocturnal Dominion continued throughout Henry's reign, with new victims selected regularly to replace those who had been driven mad or had found ways to escape the court. The ritual became so central to Henry's sense of identity that he could no longer function without the psychological validation it provided. Court records suggest that he became physically ill when forced to go more than a few weeks without conducting the ceremony. Our fourth ritual takes us to the frozen courts of medieval Scandinavia, where the Viking traditions of royal power had evolved into something that combined the worst aspects of pagan brutality with corrupted Christian imagery. King Magnus Barefoot of Norway, who ruled from 1093 to 1103 AD, institutionalized a practice called the Rite of Blood Brotherhood that transformed the ancient Viking concept of loyalty into something that belonged in the deepest circles of hell. Magnus had inherited a kingdom where Christianity was still new and competing with older traditions that traced back to the worship of Odin and Thor. Rather than choose between these conflicting religious systems, he created a hybrid that combined Christian ritual with pagan sacrifice in ways that amplified the worst aspects of both traditions while eliminating any elements of mercy or redemption. The Rite of Blood Brotherhood was ostensibly about creating unbreakable bonds between the king and his most trusted warriors. In practice, it was about psychological domination so complete that participants lost all sense of individual identity and became extensions of Magnus's will. The ritual began with the selection of young men from noble families, typically sons who had been sent to court to learn the arts of warfare and statecraft. These young nobles were isolated from other court members and subjected to weeks of preparation that combined sleep deprivation, dietary restriction, and exposure to psychoactive substances derived from mushrooms and herbs that grew in the northern forests. By the time they were ready for the actual ceremony, their grip on reality had been deliberately weakened to the point where they would accept virtually any explanation for what was happening to them. The ceremony itself took place in chambers carved directly into the rock beneath Magnus's fortress, spaces that had been used for pagan rituals since before the arrival of Christianity in Norway. The walls were covered with carvings that depicted scenes of sacrifice and submission, images that had been modified to include Christian symbols in ways that created a nightmarish fusion of competing religious traditions. Magnus would appear dressed in robes that combined Christian vestments with symbols of Odin's power, presenting himself as both priest and god-king. The young nobles would be brought before him one at a time, each having been told that they were about to undergo a sacred initiation that would bind them to their king in ways that transcended ordinary human relationships. What followed was a systematic process of psychological and physical violation designed to destroy the participant's sense of self and replace it with absolute devotion to Magnus. The specific techniques used were recorded in runes carved into the chamber walls, a coded language that wasn't fully deciphered until modern archaeologists developed better understanding of pre-Christian Scandinavian religious practices. The physical aspects of the ritual were designed to create maximum psychological trauma while maintaining the pretense of religious significance. Participants were required to consume mixtures of blood and herbs while performing acts that violated both Christian and pagan moral codes simultaneously. The combination of psychoactive substances and extreme psychological stress created altered states of consciousness where normal moral constraint ceased to function. But the true horror of the Rite of Blood Brotherhood lay not in its physical brutality, but in its psychological sophistication. Magnus had developed techniques for breaking down individual personality that were remarkably advanced for his time period. He understood intuitively that the most effective way to control people was not through fear alone, but through the systematic destruction of their capacity for independent moral judgment. Each participant was required to commit acts that were specifically chosen to destroy their previous sense of identity. Christians were forced to participate in pagan sacrifices. Former pagans were required to desecrate Christian symbols. Warriors who prided themselves on honor were made to engage in cowardly betrayals. Nobles who valued their family lineage were forced to participate in acts that would bring shame on their bloodlines for generations. The psychological impact was exactly what Magnus intended. Within weeks of undergoing the ritual, participants displayed what medieval observers described as complete personality changes. They became utterly devoted to Magnus, incapable of questioning his orders or maintaining relationships with anyone outside his immediate circle. They had been transformed from individual human beings into components of Magnus's extended will. Magnus himself became increasingly dependent on the psychological validation provided by these rituals. Like Henry II, he began to see himself as having transcended ordinary human limitations, but his delusions took on specifically Scandinavian characteristics. He believed that he had achieved a form of immortality through his connection to ancient pagan gods, that his power would persist even after his physical death through the souls he had bound to his service. This belief influenced his military campaigns, which became increasingly reckless as he sought to demonstrate his supposed divine invincibility. He launched raids against superior forces, convinced that his blood brothers would fight with supernatural courage because they were no longer fully human. The strategy worked for several years, partly because his warriors did indeed fight with desperate fury, but ultimately led to his death in Ireland in 1103 AD when his divine protection proved insufficient against Norman steel. The Rite of Blood Brotherhood didn't die with Magnus. His successors continued the practice in modified forms, each adding their own refinements to the basic psychological techniques. The ritual spread to other Scandinavian kingdoms and eventually influenced similar practices throughout Northern Europe, creating a network of royal courts where systematic psychological manipulation became the foundation of political power. These practices continued in various forms until the late medieval period, when the increasing power of the Catholic Church and changing political structures made them too dangerous to maintain openly. But their influence persisted in more subtle ways, contributing to patterns of royal behavior that emphasized absolute submission and psychological dominance over traditional forms of political loyalty. The legacy of these rituals can be traced through genealogical records that show suspicious patterns of mental instability and moral corruption among the descendants of participants. Families that had been subjected to these psychological techniques often displayed what medieval physicians called hereditary madness, patterns of behavior that suggested the trauma had become embedded in their bloodlines through mechanisms that medieval science couldn't understand, but that modern psychology recognizes as intergenerational transmission of severe psychological trauma. The fifth ritual on our list brings us to the shadowed halls of medieval France, where King Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, developed what court chroniclers euphemistically called the sacrament of royal purification. This wasn't about cleansing sin or achieving spiritual enlightenment. This was about a king who believed that true divine authority could only be achieved by systematically corrupting everything that society held sacred. Philip IV ruled from 1285 to 1314 AD, and his reign was marked by conflicts with Pope Boniface VIII that ultimately led to the papal seat being moved to Avignon. What most historians don't realize is that Philip's assault on papal authority wasn't just political. It was the external manifestation of internal rituals that were designed to prove his superiority over all forms of spiritual authority, including God himself. The sacrament of royal purification required Philip to select members of the clergy who served in his royal chapel, priests and monks who had dedicated their lives to serving God and who trusted their king to protect their spiritual mission. The selection process was conducted during Lent, when the medieval mind believed spiritual barriers were at their weakest and supernatural influences could most easily penetrate the mortal world. Those selected were told they had been chosen for a special honor, a secret ceremony that would demonstrate Philip's unique relationship with divine authority. They were brought to chambers beneath the royal chapel at Vincennes, rooms that had been constructed according to specifications found in manuscripts that Philip's agents had stolen from the Vatican's secret archives during diplomatic missions to Rome. These chambers were designed as inverted versions of sacred spaces. Where a normal chapel would have a crucifix, these rooms featured crosses that had been deliberately desecrated through means so explicit that medieval chroniclers could only describe them through coded references to biblical passages about abomination. Where holy water would normally be found, the chambers contained substances that had been blessed through rituals that inverted every aspect of Christian ceremony. The priests and monks who entered these chambers found themselves in an environment that systematically challenged everything they believed about the nature of sacred and profane. The walls were covered with religious artwork that had been subtly modified to include elements that transformed scenes of holy devotion into something far more sinister. Images of saints appeared to be engaged in acts that violated their vows, while depictions of Christ himself were altered in ways that suggested corruption rather than redemption. Philip would appear dressed in vestments that mimicked papal regalia, but incorporated symbols that had been specifically chosen to mock Catholic authority. He presented himself not as a servant of God, but as God's replacement, a divine figure who had transcended the need for traditional religious constraints. The psychological impact on the assembled clergy was immediate and devastating, as they found themselves forced to choose between their loyalty to their king and their fundamental beliefs about the nature of divine authority. What Philip demanded of these holy men went beyond mere submission to royal authority. He required them to participate in ceremonies that were designed as deliberate inversions of Catholic ritual, practices that transformed the most sacred elements of their faith into instruments of spiritual corruption. The Eucharist was perverted into something that celebrated domination rather than sacrifice. Confession became a process where the priests were forced to reveal not their sins, but their deepest spiritual doubts and fears, which Philip then used to destroy their faith systematically. The most disturbing aspect of the sacrament of royal purification was its use of religious ecstasy as a weapon of psychological destruction. Philip had studied accounts of mystical experiences reported by saints and had developed techniques for artificially inducing similar states of consciousness. But where genuine mystical experience was supposed to bring the soul closer to God, Philip's artificial version was designed to create a psychological dependency that made the participants incapable of distinguishing between divine revelation and royal manipulation. The process began with extended periods of fasting and sleep deprivation that weakened the participants' psychological defenses. This was followed by the administration of substances derived from ergot-infected grain, compounds that medieval alchemists had learned could induce powerful hallucinations when properly prepared. The combination created altered states of consciousness where normal rational thinking became impossible. In these altered states, Philip would appear to his victims as a figure of divine authority, speaking in languages they didn't recognize but somehow understood, delivering revelations that seemed to come directly from God, but that actually served to justify Philip's most extreme claims about royal power. The psychological impact was so profound that participants would emerge from these experiences convinced that they had received direct divine confirmation of Philip's authority over all earthly and spiritual matters. The aftermath of these ceremonies was carefully orchestrated to reinforce the psychological transformation. Participants were isolated from other members of the clergy and subjected to ongoing indoctrination that used their artificially induced mystical experiences as proof of Philip's divine status. They were gradually introduced to increasingly extreme interpretations of royal authority, each step justified by reference to their supposed divine revelations. Within months, these corrupted clergy members had been transformed from servants of God into instruments of Philip's will. They preached sermons that justified the king's attacks on papal authority, administered sacraments that had been subtly modified to reinforce royal rather than divine power, and served as a network of spies who reported on the loyalty and activities of other church members throughout France. Philip himself became increasingly convinced that his rituals had actually transformed him into a divine figure. He began to see his conflicts with the Pope not as political disputes, but as cosmic battles between competing gods. His persecution of the Knights Templar, which culminated in their dissolution in 1312 AD, was motivated not just by greed for their wealth, but by his belief that their resistance to his authority represented a form of blasphemy against his divine status. The sacrament of royal purification continued throughout Philip's reign, with new victims selected regularly to replace those who had been driven mad by the psychological trauma or who had found ways to escape the corrupted royal court. The ritual became so central to Philip's sense of identity that he began to apply similar techniques to his diplomatic relationships, using artificially induced religious experiences to manipulate foreign dignitaries and church officials. Our sixth ritual takes us to the plague-ravaged courts of 14th century Europe, where the Black Death had created an atmosphere of apocalyptic desperation that allowed previously unthinkable practices to flourish openly. King Edward III of England, ruling from 1327 to 1377 AD, developed what his court physicians called the Rite of Vital Transference, a ceremony that promised to transfer life force from the dying to the living through means that combined medieval medical theory with systematic murder. Edward had watched the plague devastate his kingdom, killing roughly one-third of England's population between 1347 and 1351 AD. The psychological impact of this catastrophe convinced him that conventional approaches to royal power were insufficient to deal with existential threats to his dynasty. If God was allowing his subjects to die in such numbers, then clearly God's protection was unreliable. Edward would have to find other sources of supernatural power, methods that didn't depend on divine mercy or church intercession. The theoretical foundation for the rite of vital transference came from manuscripts that Edward's agents had acquired from Islamic scholars in Spain, texts that described medical practices supposedly used by ancient Persian kings to extend their lives through the systematic harvesting of life essence from younger, healthier subjects. These manuscripts had been translated from Arabic into Latin by corrupt monks who were paid enormous sums to ignore the moral implications of what they were translating. The ritual required Edward to identify subjects who were dying of plague, but who had not yet reached the final stages of the disease. The selection process was conducted by royal physicians who had been trained to recognize the specific signs that indicated a person was close to death but still possessed what medieval medical theory called vital heat. the life force that animated the body, and that could supposedly be transferred from one person to another through properly conducted ceremonies. Those selected were brought to chambers that had been constructed according to specifications found in the translated Islamic texts. These rooms were designed to facilitate what medieval physicians believed was the physical transfer of life essence from dying bodies to living ones. The walls were lined with mirrors arranged in geometric patterns that were supposed to focus and amplify vital energy, while the floors were inscribed with symbols that combined Islamic medical notation with corrupted Christian imagery. The dying plague victims were placed on specially constructed tables that had been designed to facilitate the extraction of what Edward's physicians called essential humors, bodily substances that medieval medical theory identified as the carriers of life force. The extraction process involved techniques that were simultaneously medical procedures and torture methods, carefully calculated to maximize the amount of vital essence that could be harvested while prolonging the victim's conscious suffering as long as possible. Edward himself would participate directly in these extractions, consuming the harvested substances while performing incantations that had been translated from the Islamic texts. The psychological impact of participating in systematic murder while consuming human remains created a form of madness that Edward mistook for divine enlightenment. He began to believe that each ceremony made him stronger, more intelligent, and more resistant to disease and aging. The ritual reached its climax during what Edward called the moment of vital absorption, when the dying victim's final breath was supposedly captured and transferred directly to the king through a complex apparatus involving tubes, filters, and condensation chambers. The entire process was designed to convince Edward that he was literally consuming the life force of his subjects, gaining their remaining years of life in addition to his own natural lifespan. The psychological impact on Edward was profound and terrifying. Each ceremony convinced him further that he had discovered the secret to immortality, that he had transcended the natural limitations that constrained ordinary mortals. He began to see his subjects not as people to be protected and governed, but as potential sources of life force to be harvested when circumstances required it. This transformation influenced every aspect of Edward's later reign. His military campaigns became increasingly reckless as he convinced himself that his artificially extended life made him invulnerable to ordinary dangers. His treatment of political prisoners became systematically cruel as he applied the techniques developed for the rite of vital transference to extract information and psychological submission from captured enemies. The ritual also created a network of corrupted physicians and courtiers who had become addicted to participating in systematic murder. These individuals formed what amounted to a secret society within Edward's court, bound together by their shared guilt and by their belief that they were participating in the scientific research that would ultimately benefit all of humanity. The rite of vital transference continued throughout the plague years, with Edward's physicians developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for identifying suitable victims and extracting maximum vital essence from their deaths. The ritual expanded beyond plague victims to include political prisoners, condemned criminals, and eventually anyone whose death could be justified through legal or military means. The practice finally ended not because of moral objections, but because the plague itself began to subside, and suitable victims became harder to find without attracting unwanted attention from church authorities. By that time, however, Edward had become so psychologically dependent on the ritual that he began to show signs of severe mental deterioration when forced to go extended periods without conducting the ceremony. The legacy of these rituals extended far beyond Edward's own reign. The techniques developed for the rite of vital transference influenced medical practices throughout medieval Europe, contributing to the development of anatomical studies that were conducted without regard for the welfare of living subjects. The psychological attitudes that justified systematic murder in the name of royal preservation became embedded in court culture and influenced the behavior of subsequent English monarchs for generations. These 6 rituals represent just the beginning of our exploration into the darkest corners of medieval royal depravity. What we've examined so far reveals a pattern of systematic corruption that transformed the concept of divine kingship into something that belonged more in a nightmare than a throne room. But the ceremonies that follow make these practices seem almost benign by comparison. The seventh ritual on our list brings us to the courts of medieval Spain, where the Reconquista had created an atmosphere of religious extremism that allowed previously unthinkable practices to flourish under the guise of holy war. King Alfonso X of Castile, who ruled from 1252 to 1284 AD, developed what his court astrologers called the Celestial Dominion Rite, a ceremony that promised to align royal power with cosmic forces through means that violated every principle of human decency while claiming divine sanction. Alfonso had become obsessed with the idea that earthly kingship was merely a reflection of celestial hierarchy, and that true royal power could only be achieved by establishing direct communication with the cosmic forces that governed the movement of stars and planets. His court included scholars who had translated Islamic astronomical texts and Jewish Kabbalistic manuscripts, creating a synthesis of occult knowledge that promised to unlock the secrets of divine authority through systematic violation of human dignity. The Celestial Dominion Rite was based on the medieval belief that human souls could be used as conduits for celestial energy, but only if those souls had been properly prepared through experiences that stripped away all earthly attachments and moral constraints. Alfonso's astrologers had calculated that the most effective conduits were individuals who had been systematically corrupted through participation in acts so vile that their spiritual essence became malleable, capable of being reshaped to serve as channels for cosmic power. The ritual required Alfonso to identify subjects who possessed specific astrological characteristics determined by their birth dates, planetary alignments, and physical features that supposedly corresponded to celestial influences. The selection process involved detailed examination of potential victims by court astrologers who used instruments imported from Islamic Spain to measure everything from skull dimensions to the patterns of veins visible through the skin. Those selected were brought to an observatory that Alfonso had constructed on the highest tower of his palace in Toledo, a structure designed according to specifications found in manuscripts that claimed to describe the temple practices of ancient Persian magi. The chamber was filled with astronomical instruments, star charts, and devices whose purposes were so disturbing that they could only be described through astrological metaphor and alchemical symbolism. The preparation phase of the ritual lasted for weeks, during which the selected individuals were subjected to a carefully calculated sequence of psychological and physical ordeals designed to break down their personalities and replace their individual will with absolute submission to Alfonso's commands. The process began with isolation in chambers where the only light came from oil lamps arranged to cast shadows that formed astrological symbols on the walls, creating an environment where normal perception of time and space became impossible. The victims were fed diets that had been calculated according to astrological principles, consuming only foods that corresponded to specific planetary influences, and that had been prepared using herbs and spices that medieval alchemists believed could alter the spiritual composition of human blood. The psychological impact of this controlled starvation, combined with the disorienting effects of the carefully manipulated environment, created states of consciousness where resistance became impossible and compliance seemed like divine revelation. Alfonso would appear to his victims dressed in robes covered with astrological symbols and claiming to speak with the authority of celestial powers. He presented himself not as a mortal king, but as an earthly representative of cosmic forces, a being who had transcended human limitations through his understanding of astronomical secrets. The psychological impact on subjects who had already been weakened by weeks of preparation was immediate and devastating. The core of the Celestial Dominion Rite involved forcing the prepared victims to participate in ceremonies that were designed as deliberate inversions of both Christian and Islamic religious practices. Where normal prayer sought divine mercy, Alfonso's rituals demanded cosmic domination. Where traditional religious ceremonies emphasized humility and submission to God, his practices required the participants to claim divine authority for themselves while simultaneously surrendering all moral autonomy to Alfonso's will. The most disturbing aspect of the ritual was its use of astronomical timing to justify acts of systematic cruelty that were presented as necessary sacrifices to celestial powers. Alfonso had calculated that certain planetary alignments created windows of opportunity when human suffering could be transformed into cosmic energy, and he scheduled his most extreme ceremonies to coincide with eclipses, conjunctions, and other astronomical events that medieval astrology associated with supernatural power. During these astronomical windows, Alfonso would conduct what he called stellar communion ceremonies, rituals that required participants to engage in acts so vile that medieval chroniclers could only hint at them through references to biblical passages about abomination and cosmic rebellion. The specific details were recorded in cipher using astrological notation, creating documents that appeared to be harmless astronomical calculations, but that actually described systematic torture and murder conducted according to celestial timetables. The psychological impact on Alfonso himself was predictably catastrophic. Each ceremony convinced him further that he had achieved genuine communication with cosmic forces, that his understanding of astronomical secrets had elevated him above all earthly authority, including papal power and divine law. He began to see his kingdom not as a political entity, but as a terrestrial reflection of celestial hierarchy, with himself as the earthly representative of stellar dominion. This cosmic delusion influenced every aspect of Alfonso's reign, leading to increasingly erratic decisions that his courtiers learned to interpret through astrological rather than political logic. His military campaigns were timed according to planetary movements rather than strategic considerations, creating a pattern of victories and defeats that seemed random to contemporary observers, but that Alfonso believed demonstrated his alignment with cosmic forces. Our eighth ritual takes us to the mountain fortresses of medieval Bavaria, where the isolation of winter courts had created conditions that allowed practices to develop that went beyond even the extremes we've already examined. Duke Albrecht III, who ruled from 1347 to 1395 AD, institutionalized something called the Rite of Perpetual Dominion, a ceremony designed to ensure that his authority would persist beyond death through the creation of what medieval necromancers called soul bonds that would tie his subjects to his will for eternity. Albrecht had become convinced that conventional forms of royal authority were temporary and inadequate, that true power required the establishment of spiritual control that would survive the physical death of both ruler and subject. His court included scholars who had acquired manuscripts from Byzantine sources that described techniques supposedly used by late Roman emperors to achieve a form of spiritual immortality through systematic corruption of their subject souls. The theoretical foundation for the Rite of Perpetual Dominion was based on medieval beliefs about the nature of spiritual authority and the mechanisms through which human souls could be bound to serve specific purposes even after death. Albrecht's necromancers had developed techniques for creating what they called spiritual vassalage, relationships of supernatural subordination that would persist in whatever afterlife awaited both master and servant. The ritual required Albrecht to identify subjects who possessed specific spiritual characteristics that made their souls suitable for eternal bondage. The selection process involved detailed examination by court necromancers who claimed to be able to detect the spiritual qualities that determined a person's suitability for posthumous service. These examinations included physical tests that were actually forms of torture, designed to assess the subject's capacity for spiritual submission. Those selected were brought to chambers carved directly into the rock beneath Albrecht's mountain fortress, spaces that had been constructed according to specifications found in the Byzantine manuscripts. These chambers were designed to facilitate what medieval necromancers believed was the process of spiritual transformation that would prepare souls for eternal service, creating environments where normal human psychology would break down and be replaced by supernatural compliance. The preparation phase of the ritual involved systematic destruction of everything that connected the victims to their normal human identity. They were forced to renounce all personal relationships, to participate in the desecration of religious symbols that had previously given their lives meaning, and to engage in acts that violated their deepest moral convictions so thoroughly that their capacity for independent moral judgment was permanently destroyed. Albrecht himself participated directly in these preparatory ceremonies, presenting himself as both the temporal authority who demanded obedience and the spiritual guide who would lead his subjects into their eternal roles as supernatural servants. The psychological techniques he employed were remarkably sophisticated, combining elements of religious indoctrination with methods of psychological manipulation that wouldn't be formally recognized by psychology for centuries. The core of the rite of perpetual dominion involved what Albrecht's necromancers called the binding of essential will, a process that supposedly transferred the victim's capacity for independent choice to Albrecht's spiritual authority. The ceremony required the subjects to participate in ritual sequences that were designed to convince them that their individual identity was an illusion, that their true spiritual nature was as extensions of Albrecht's will. The psychological impact was exactly what Albrecht intended. Subjects who underwent the complete ritual emerged as fundamentally different beings, displaying what medieval observers described as complete personality dissolution. They retained their memories and basic cognitive functions, but their capacity for independent thought or moral judgment had been systematically eliminated. These spiritually transformed subjects became the core of Albrecht's court, serving not just as administrators and soldiers, but as living proof of his supernatural authority. Their absolute obedience and apparent psychological contentment convinced other courtiers that Albrecht had indeed achieved mastery over forces that transcended ordinary political power. The ritual expanded over time to include increasingly elaborate ceremonies designed to reinforce the spiritual bonds between Albrecht and his transformed subjects. These renewal ceremonies were conducted according to seasonal schedules that Albrecht's necromancers claimed were necessary to maintain the supernatural relationships that formed the foundation of his authority. Our ninth ritual brings us to the courts of medieval Poland, where King Casimir IV had developed what his court alchemists called the transmutation of sacred authority, a ceremony that promised to transform political power into something approaching divine essence through systematic violation of the most fundamental taboos of medieval society. This wasn't just about establishing royal supremacy over earthly matters. This was about achieving a form of spiritual transformation that would place Casimir beyond the reach of divine judgment itself. Casimir had become convinced that conventional royal authority was fundamentally limited because it remained subject to divine oversight and moral constraint. His court alchemists had acquired texts from Islamic Spain that described techniques supposedly used by ancient Persian kings to achieve spiritual transmutation through engagement in acts so extreme that they transcended normal categories of good and evil, creating a form of moral transcendence that placed the practitioner beyond conventional spiritual authority. The transmutation of sacred authority was based on alchemical theories that viewed human spiritual essence as a substance that could be refined and purified through exposure to increasingly extreme experiences. Just as base metals could supposedly be transformed into gold through proper alchemical processes, human souls could be transmuted into something approaching divine essence through systematic participation in acts that violated every principle of conventional morality. The ritual required Casimir to identify subjects who represented the most sacred and inviolable aspects of medieval society. These weren't just random victims, but individuals whose corruption would demonstrate Casimir's power over the spiritual forces that governed human civilization. The selection process focused on members of the clergy who had achieved reputations for exceptional holiness, noble women whose virtue was considered beyond question, and children from families whose innocence was seen as a reflection of divine grace. The corruption of these carefully selected victims was conducted according to alchemical principles that treated spiritual purity as a substance to be extracted and absorbed. Casimir's alchemists had developed techniques for what they called spiritual distillation, processes that were designed to destroy the victim's original spiritual essence while transferring its purifying power to Casimir himself. The chambers where these rituals were conducted had been constructed as alchemical laboratories dedicated to spiritual rather than material transformation. The walls were lined with apparatus designed for the extraction and refinement of what medieval alchemists believed were the essential humors of spiritual authority, substances that could be harvested from corrupted victims and incorporated into Casimir's own spiritual composition. The specific techniques used in these spiritual distillation processes were recorded in alchemical notation that disguised systematic torture and murder as scientific procedure. The victims were subjected to carefully calibrated sequences of physical and psychological ordeal designed to break down their spiritual resistance while preserving the essential elements that Casimir sought to absorb. The psychological impact on Casimir was exactly what his alchemists had promised. Each ceremony convinced him further that he was undergoing genuine spiritual transformation, that his participation in these extreme violations of moral law was actually elevating him to a higher form of existence that transcended ordinary human limitations. Our final ritual takes us to the twilight of the medieval period, where the Renaissance courts of Italy had created environments where ancient knowledge and modern corruption combined to produce practices that surpassed even the extremes we've already examined. Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, developed what his court philosophers called the apotheosis rite, a ceremony designed to achieve actual divinity through systematic violation of every principle that separated human from divine authority. Cesare had access to manuscripts that had been recovered from Byzantine sources during the fall of Constantinople, texts that claimed to describe the secret practices used by late Roman emperors who had achieved divine status through techniques that combined political power with spiritual transformation. These manuscripts suggested that true divinity could be achieved by demonstrating absolute power over the forces of life and death, creation and destruction, salvation and damnation. The apotheosis rite was designed as the ultimate expression of human will, transcending divine authority. It required Cesare to demonstrate his power over every aspect of human existence that was normally considered sacred or inviolable, proving that no spiritual or moral force could constrain his authority. The ritual involved the systematic corruption of representatives from every level of medieval society, from peasants to princes, from novice nuns to cardinal archbishops. Each victim was chosen to represent a specific aspect of the spiritual order that Cesare sought to transcend, and their corruption was designed to demonstrate his authority over the divine forces they represented. The ceremonies were conducted in chambers beneath the Vatican itself, spaces that had been modified to serve as theaters for the ultimate demonstration of human power over divine authority. The psychological impact on both victims and observers was intended to create a new form of religious experience, one that worshipped human will rather than divine mercy. Cesare's transformation through these rituals was so complete that contemporary observers struggled to describe what he had become. He had transcended the normal categories of human evil and achieved something that seemed to exist beyond conventional moral understanding. His death in 1507 ended the most extreme expression of medieval royal depravity, but the psychological and spiritual damage he had created continued to influence European court culture for generations. These 10 rituals represent the darkest achievements of medieval European kingship, practices that transformed political authority into instruments of spiritual corruption, so complete that they challenged the very foundations of human civilization. They remind us that absolute power doesn't just corrupt absolutely, it creates appetites that can never be satisfied and delusions that can never be dispelled. The men who participated in these ceremonies believed they were transcending human limitations and achieving forms of divine authority. In reality, they were demonstrating the ultimate consequences of power, exercised without moral constraint, creating legacies of psychological and spiritual damage that would echo through European history for centuries to come. These 10 rituals reveal a pattern that should chill us to our bones. What we've witnessed isn't just historical curiosity or medieval barbarism. These ceremonies represent the logical endpoint of absolute power, unchecked by moral constraint, human appetites freed from divine limitation, and royal authority transformed into something that devoured souls along with bodies. Each king we've examined believed he was transcending ordinary human limitations, achieving divine status through systematic violation of everything his society held sacred. In reality, they were demonstrating the ultimate corruption that occurs when power becomes its own justification, when might truly does make right, and when the strong prey upon the weak without consequence or restraint. The psychological techniques these medieval monarchs developed were remarkably sophisticated, often anticipating methods that wouldn't be formally recognized by psychology for centuries. They understood intuitively that the most effective way to control people wasn't through fear alone, but through the systematic destruction of their capacity for independent moral judgment. Perhaps most disturbing of all, these weren't isolated incidents or the actions of a few mad rulers. These were systematic traditions passed down through royal bloodlines, refined and perfected across generations, creating networks of corruption that influenced European court culture for centuries. The damage they inflicted extended far beyond their immediate victims, creating patterns of psychological trauma that echoed through noble families long after the original perpetrators had died. Today, as we face our own struggles with power and authority, these medieval horrors serve as a warning about what happens when those who rule us lose all connection to the moral constraints that make civilization possible. The distance between medieval throne rooms and modern quarters of power may be smaller than we'd like to believe. The ghosts of these forgotten victims still whisper from history's shadows, reminding us that the price of unchecked authority is always paid in human suffering, and that the corruption of power leaves stains that can never be fully washed clean.